Flight attendant slaps teenager, freezes when a powerful lawyer steps in. Prepare yourselves for a story charged with tension and brimming with unexpected turns. Our tale begins with a seemingly routine flight, where high-altitude turbulence becomes the least of everyone's concerns. Tucked among the passengers is a teenager whose striking demeanor masks his true identity. He's the son of a powerful attorney known for his fearlessness in the courtroom. Little does anyone aboard realize that a small misunderstanding could erupt into a massive confrontation. What starts as a heated spat with a flight attendant quickly spirals into a suspenseful chain of events filled with mysterious threats, shocking revelations, and ultimate retribution. Stay with us, as this journey promises more than just a bumpy ride. Before we dive in, if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. If you're excited about this story, let us know. If you enjoyed the video, press 1. If not, press O. Your feedback really inspires me to gather more uplifting and meaningful stories. Nathan Taylor was only 16 years old, yet he carried himself with a poise that made people question his age. He had a discerning gaze that flickered with intelligence every time he spoke. On this particular summer afternoon, he strolled onto a United Airlines Boeing 737, departing from Los Angeles International Airport toward New York City. His mother had insisted on making the trip to visit family, while his father, Stephen Taylor, the renowned legal eagle, remained behind to prepare for a critical court case. Nathan settled into his seat, glancing around with a practiced calm. Despite his father's fame, he had always tried to blend into the crowd. In his mind, this was just another flight, a mere stepping stone to a simple family visit. Little did he know that fate had other plans. A tall flight attendant named Miss Ramirez passed by, discreetly eyeing the rows for any sign of trouble. She exuded the kind of professionalism one would expect from years of service. But there was a peculiar edge to her expression, an almost imperceptible tension etched into her features. As the plane taxied onto the runway, Nathan noticed a man in the seat next to him, fiddling nervously with a frayed carry-on bag. The man's face was drawn, lines of stress bracketing his eyes, as if he carried a tremendous burden. When Miss Ramirez stepped closer to retrieve a trash item, the man's hand trembled. There was no direct sign of danger, yet something about his anxious disposition set the first gear of suspense into motion. Moments later, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing their departure. Nathan closed his eyes, recollecting all the times he'd flown with his father. His father's commanding presence often led people to assume they had special privileges. But Stephen Taylor had always taught Nathan to treat others respectfully, reminding him that social standing did not grant anyone the right to be dismissive or cruel. As the plane roared to life, Miss Ramirez began the safety demonstration with studied precision. Nathan observed her mechanical smile and the flicker of fatigue behind her eyes. Midway through the demonstration, the nervous man next to Nathan began to panic, rummaging through his pockets and exhaling ragged breaths. After the seatbelt sign pinged off, Miss Ramirez approached the anxious passenger. "Sir, is everything all right?" she asked, her tone clipped yet trying for gentleness. She had been in the industry long enough to recognize passengers on the brink of a breakdown. "I'm fine," he muttered. Just not used to flying. Could I have some water, Miss?" Ramirez hesitated for a moment. Though her job required politeness, she seemed visibly annoyed. "I'll see if we can get water soon," she replied briskly before turning away. Nathan raised an eyebrow at her curt response. Every flight attendant he'd encountered before had extended at least a patient courtesy to uneasy flyers. A slight tremor of tension hummed through the cabin air. Nathan couldn't know it yet, but the seeds of conflict had already begun to take root. Cruising at a stable altitude, the attendants started their beverage service. Nathan watched Miss Ramirez push the heavy cart along the aisle. The clang of tiny bottles and plastic cups accompanied her progress. Occasionally, she tossed a perfunctory smile at the passengers who caught her eye, though each smile barely reached her cheeks. As she neared Nathan's row, he noticed the passenger across the aisle, a frail elderly woman with trembling hands struggling to press the call button. She wore an oxygen tube connected to a portable canister at her feet. Her watery eyes pleaded for assistance, but Miss Ramirez breezed past as if she hadn't seen the woman's raised hand. Nathan frowned, unfastening his seatbelt to help the elderly lady. Before he could move, Miss Ramirez glanced back and spotted him. "Sir, remain seated," she snapped, as though Nathan were breaking some cardinal rule. "I was just trying to help," he insisted, nodding toward the woman. The flight attendant's gaze darted to the elderly passenger, but instead of assisting, she huffed irritably and continued distributing beverages. Nathan felt a pang of frustration, but he reminded himself to keep calm. He didn't want any trouble, especially after all the times his father had warned him about misinterpretations in public confrontations. "Soon enough, miss." Ramirez returned to hand Nathan a small cup of soda. He forced a polite thank you, but she barely acknowledged him. The tension simmering between them was faint but palpable, setting the stage for conflicts yet to come. Nathan reclined in his seat, forcing himself to focus on the novel he'd brought, a thriller about a journalist unraveling corporate secrets. The words on the page, however, blurred as his attention kept drifting to Miss Ramirez's brusque demeanor. Something about her manner unsettled him, and judging by the worried glances from other passengers, he wasn't alone. The pilot announced moderate turbulence ahead. The cabin shook gently, overhead compartments rattling as the plane cut through a pocket of rough air. Seatbelt signs lit up with an urgent ding. Across the aisle, the elderly woman attempted to secure her oxygen canister. Her hands fumbled, and the tubing began to slip. Nathan's instincts urged him to help, but he remembered Miss Ramirez's warning. Despite that, he could hardly watch someone struggle. Carefully, he unbuckled and knelt beside her. In a few swift movements, he adjusted the canister and made sure the tubing was secure around her ears. He offered a gentle smile. "Are you okay, ma'am?" She nodded feebly. "Thank you. My hands just don't work like they used to." Before Nathan could return to his seat, Miss Ramirez appeared behind him. Her eyes flashed with irritation. "Sit down immediately," she barked. Her voice trembled with more intensity than the actual turbulence. Passengers craned their necks to observe the escalating drama. Nathan gritted his teeth, stifling his inclination to snap back. He quickly complied, not wanting to exacerbate the tension, but deep down he suspected this was only the beginning of something bigger and far more sinister. When the turbulence subsided, Miss Ramirez took on the role of enforcer, patrolling the aisles and seemingly singling out passengers she deemed problematic. She chastised a young mother whose toddler cried too loudly, and she argued with a businessman who insisted on finishing his laptop work despite the seatbelt sign. Every encounter added another layer of tension to the flight. Nathan tried to refocus on his novel, but the storyline seemed dull compared to the building real-life drama. A hush fell over the cabin as Miss Ramirez grew increasingly irritable. Even the anxious man next to Nathan was too startled to ask for anything more, sipping nervously at his water. Just when Nathan thought things might settle, Miss Ramirez abruptly stopped at his row. "You," she said, pointing at him, "you need to watch your attitude. Flying is a privilege, not a right." Stunned, Nathan looked up. "I'm sorry? I'm not sure what." She cut him off with a dismissive wave. "I saw you standing during turbulence. You think you can just do whatever you want." He could feel the heat rising in his chest. "I was helping that lady." "Don't talk back," she snapped, her voice echoing through the hushed cabin. "One more outburst from you, and we'll have to consider removing you from this flight." At that moment, Nathan felt an unfamiliar surge of anger. He wasn't used to being accused of wrongdoing, especially when he'd done nothing but show concern for another passenger. But something deeper was happening beneath the surface, something Miss Ramirez couldn't possibly predict. The exchange ended as abruptly as it started, with Miss Ramirez stepping away to tend to a passenger in another row. But the damage was done. Nathan could sense his heart pounding. He'd been taught to de-escalate conflict, to remain respectful. Yet for the first time, he felt truly cornered. He decided to send a quick text to his mother, letting her know about the strange atmosphere on the flight. However, his phone remained on airplane mode with no Wi-Fi purchased. He sighed, realizing he had no choice but to wait until they landed to share the incident. Minutes dragged on. The cabin lights dimmed as they flew into early evening. Passengers settled into their seats for a short nap or a moment of quiet. But every once in a while, Miss Ramirez's stern voice would jolt them from the lull. She reprimanded a child for fiddling with the window shade, then scolded a man for using the lavatory when the seatbelt sign was no longer lit, her reasons seeming contradictory. At one point, the anxious passenger next to Nathan whispered, "What's up with her? She's scaring me more than the flight itself." Nathan shrugged, offering a small, empathetic smile. "I don't know. Maybe she's having a bad day." Somehow, Nathan sensed it was more than just a bad day. There was an underlying tension in Miss Ramirez's behavior, a desperation or anger simmering just beneath her polished uniform. That unspoken tension was about to erupt, and no one aboard was prepared for the outcome. With the cabin lights dimmed, meal service commenced. Miss Ramirez's fellow flight attendants moved quietly through the aisles, handing out trays of preheated dishes. Despite their best efforts to keep the flight experience pleasant, the uneasy vibe left many passengers on edge. The elderly woman across from Nathan fidgeted with her napkin, occasionally stealing wary glances at Miss Ramirez, as if anticipating a sudden outburst. Nathan decided to distract himself by putting on his headphones and listening to music. Yet, even the melody couldn't drown out the oppressive tension. Every footstep Miss Ramirez took seemed like a drumbeat of impending conflict. Eventually, Miss Ramirez reached Nathan's row, distributing his meal tray without a word. He thanked her quietly, but she only offered a faint nod, her eyes narrowed. Midway through his meal, Nathan felt a tap on his shoulder. A middle-aged woman 2 rows behind leaned forward, whispering, "Could you pass me a napkin, please? I've run out, and I don't want to bother the attendant." Nathan handed her a couple of his extra napkins, but Miss Ramirez turned just in time to see the exchange. Her face hardened. She stepped closer, scanning the row. "Is there a problem here?" The woman shook her head quickly, as though fearing retribution. "No, ma'am. I just needed a napkin." Miss Ramirez's gaze flicked to Nathan. "We provide plenty of napkins in the meal tray. You need to follow protocol and ask a flight attendant if you require something." Once more, the sense of injustice flared within Nathan. But he bit his lip, trying to keep the peace, still unaware of how close everything was to snapping like a taut wire under pressure. Nightfall enveloped the plane, and many passengers dozed off beneath thin blankets provided by the airline. The soft hum of engines was occasionally pierced by Miss Ramirez's sharp commands or the rattling of the drink cart. Nathan couldn't sleep. The tension gnawed at him. He was old enough to recognize when something was dangerously amiss, and Miss Ramirez's behavior crossed the boundary of mere strictness into something more volatile. Each time he shifted in his seat, he felt her watchful eyes on him, as though waiting for an excuse to strike. Around midnight, the anxious passenger next to Nathan abruptly gasped for air, panic gripping him. He pressed the call button, but Miss Ramirez was nowhere to be seen. Nathan quickly flagged down another flight attendant, a younger man who seemed genuinely concerned. The attendant rushed to get a paper bag and offered calming reassurance. Minutes later, Miss Ramirez appeared, her expression a storm cloud. "Why didn't you wait for me to attend to this?" she demanded, directing her anger at Nathan rather than her colleague. Nathan drew in a slow breath. He needed help. "Your colleague was closer. He should have called me," Miss Ramirez replied, her eyes flickering. "This is my section." Her voice carried a proprietary edge that felt strangely personal. At that moment, Nathan realized that her frustration wasn't just about airline protocol. Something deeper, something personal or psychological was fueling her aggression. And in the cramped quarters of an airplane, there was nowhere to hide from the storm about to break. As the flight continued through the dark hours, the passengers who remained awake felt an undercurrent of anxiety. Hushed conversations rose from scattered seats, stories of Miss Ramirez's abruptness circulating among them. The anxious passenger next to Nathan eventually fell into a fitful sleep, trembling whenever the plane jolted. Nathan found himself reflecting on his father's legal battles. Stephen Taylor had gained a reputation for taking on civil rights cases, ensuring that the powerless had a voice. How many times had Nathan witnessed his father dismantle an abusive authority figure in court? A pang of regret struck him. If only his father were here, Miss Ramirez would never get away with such behavior. Eventually, the sky outside began to lighten, revealing the first rays of dawn. The flight was long, and they still had hours ahead. Nathan dozed off for a brief moment, lulled by the engine's roar, only to be awakened by a commotion in the aisle. Missa Ramirez stood over a trembling teenager, another passenger about Nathan's age, accusing him of tampering with the overhead compartment. The boy denied it, tears in his eyes. Witnesses whispered that he merely tried to retrieve a jacket. Miss Ramirez didn't seem to care. "You could have caused an emergency situation," she hissed, clenching her fists. The boy recoiled, hugging himself protectively. Seeing the injustice, Nathan felt his heart pound. He wanted to intervene, but caution held him back. Miss Ramirez appeared on the edge, as though any challenge would ignite her fury. Unbeknownst to everyone on board, that dangerous threshold was alarmingly near. Tension escalated rapidly after Miss Ramirez's confrontation with the other teen. Passengers exchanged uneasy glances, silently pleading for someone to step in and stop the ever-tightening coil of aggression. But fear of reprisal, coupled with the desire to avoid involvement, kept most people quietly in their seats. Nathan, however, felt compelled to do something. He tried to catch the eye of the younger male flight attendant, the one who'd helped the anxious man, but the attendant was busy restocking the galley, his face drawn with quiet worry. Suddenly, a soft cry came from the front rows. The elderly woman with the oxygen canister sounded distressed. Her feeble pleas traveled through the hushed cabin. "Help! Help me, please." She had dropped her canister and it rolled toward the aisle, tangling the tubing. Once again, Nathan unbuckled his seatbelt. He didn't care if Miss Ramirez objected. He wasn't about to let the woman suffer. Racing forward, he gently lifted the canister back onto her lap and adjusted her tubing. She squeezed his hand in gratitude, her frail fingers trembling. Just then, Miss Ramirez appeared, eyes flashing like warning lights. "I told you to remain seated," she spat. Without waiting for an explanation, she grabbed Nathan's arm in a crushing grip. "You are a repeated safety hazard." Nathan's heart pounded, but he kept his voice even. She needed help. Her oxygen. That was all he managed to say before Miss Ramirez, driven by anger and losing any semblance of restraint, delivered a sharp slap to Nathan's face. The sound reverberated through the stunned cabin, leaving everyone wide-eyed and horrified. Silence enveloped the plane like a suffocating blanket. Several passengers gasped, while others scrambled to unfasten their seatbelts, ready to intervene if things spiraled further. Nathan stood frozen, his cheeks stinging and his mind reeling from disbelief. In the immediate aftermath, Miss Ramirez seemed just as shocked by her action. Her hand trembled, the rage in her eyes momentarily replaced by something akin to regret. Yet, the tension in her body suggested she was equally prepared to defend her outburst, as though snapping back to the role of authoritarian was the only way she knew to cope with this situation. Nathan clenched his fists, not knowing how to respond. He'd never been struck before, especially not in public, and certainly not by an adult figure who was supposed to ensure passenger safety. It was humiliating, infuriating, and profoundly wrong. Passengers erupted in frantic whispers. A mother covered her child's eyes. A businessman began recording on his phone, capturing Miss Ramirez's face contorting through a kaleidoscope of conflicting emotions: anger, fear, defiance. Then, the unexpected twist. A voice from the front of the plane spoke up, calm yet commanding. It belonged to an off-duty pilot deadheading in first class. "Ma'am, step away from the passenger," he instructed firmly. Miss Ramirez hesitated, glaring at him. But the uniform carried weight, and she released Nathan's arm. In that brief respite, the cabin's collective shock transformed into a swirl of panicked energy. Everyone sensed that the fallout from this single act would be enormous, and they were right. The off-duty pilot identified himself as Captain Foster. His broad shoulders and measured composure exuded authority. He strode down the aisle, stopping inches away from Miss Ramirez. Though calm, his voice bore the sharp edge of a superior addressing gross misconduct. "I saw what happened. We need to handle this immediately. Go to the galley and wait for me there." Miss Ramirez stood defiant, but under the pilot's steely gaze, she relented. She turned sharply on her heel and walked away, fists clenching at her sides. Nathan stood by the elderly woman's seat, cheeks flushed and eyes stinging, though no tears fell. Captain Foster gently placed a hand on Nathan's shoulder. "Are you all right?" Nathan nodded, though the shock reverberated through him. "I think so," he replied quietly, trying to remain composed. Within his chest, rage battled with a sense of betrayal. He'd done nothing wrong, yet he was the one assaulted. The elderly woman reached out, her frail voice trembling. "He was just helping me," she said, looking up at Captain Foster. "He saved me from losing my oxygen." Across the aisle, the man with the phone whispered, "I recorded everything. This is unacceptable." A small chorus of agreement emerged from the seats around them. Indeed, Miss Ramirez's assault had crossed a line, but no one yet realized that Nathan was not just any teenager. He was the son of Stephen Taylor, one of the most formidable attorneys in the state. That revelation would come in due time, and its impact would be seismic. Captain Foster guided Nathan toward an empty seat in business class, away from the immediate chaos. He summoned a different flight attendant, Mr. Wells, the one who had previously assisted the anxious passenger, to tend to Nathan and ensure he was calm. "Stay here. We'll need a full report," Captain Foster explained gently. "Try to relax if possible. We have protocols for this." Nathan's mind buzzed with a whirlwind of thoughts. Should he contact his father right away? How would his dad react to this? He pulled out his phone, forgetting for a moment that there was no signal. Anxiously, he decided to wait until they landed. Meanwhile, Miss Ramirez stood in the galley, pacing like a caged animal. The tension radiating from her was so intense that other crew members gave her a wide berth. Captain Foster approached her calmly, but his voice carried a note of authority that left little room for argument. "We need to document everything. You struck a passenger, which is grounds for immediate disciplinary action. Is there anything you'd like to say before we proceed?" Miss Ramirez's hands trembled at her sides. "He was disobeying direct instructions," she insisted, her voice cracking. "He endangered the flight by leaving his seat without permission." Captain Foster frowned. "We were not in Turbulence at that moment, and from what multiple passengers have said, he was helping someone in need." Miss Ramirez's eyes flickered. She swallowed hard, knowing she was cornered but not yet ready to face the consequences. It was a precarious moment, a standoff inside a pressurized cabin. The next steps would determine how this crisis would unravel and who would bear the brunt of it. The situation reached the ears of the cockpit crew, who promptly radioed ground control to report a serious in-flight incident. Rumors circulated among the passengers that law enforcement might meet them at the gate upon arrival. Anxiety mounted in the cabin, fusing with the stale air and turning every breath into a tense gulp. Nathan tried to calm himself by gazing out of the window at the endless expanse of clouds. Despite the injustice he'd just suffered, he felt a glimmer of relief that someone with authority, Captain Foster, had stepped in. At least now, Miss Ramirez couldn't continue her pattern of bullying. Throughout the plane, conversations erupted. A business traveler shook his head in disbelief, wondering how a flight attendant could lose control so severely. The anxious passenger, having witnessed the slap, quietly confided in a seatmate that the ordeal was like something out of a nightmare. The mother of the crying toddler whispered frantically to her husband, recalling how Miss Ramirez had nearly berated her child. In the galley, Captain Foster and Miss Ramirez engaged in a hushed but intense discussion. Though no one could hear their exact words, the flurry of Miss Ramirez's gestures made it clear she was attempting to justify her actions. Captain Foster, however, remained steadfast, occasionally shaking his head. Soon, Mr. Wells returned to Nathan's row and gently asked him to write a statement about what happened. Nathan agreed, although each sentence he wrote brought a fresh wave of shock and anger. He knew the significance of capturing every detail his father had instilled in him, the importance of thorough documentation. Chapter 15, approximately 250 words. Hours felt like days as the plane began its descent into New York City. The pilot announced their approach, requesting that everyone return to their seats and fasten their belts. Nathan handed his written statement to Mr. Wells, who thanked him with a sympathetic nod. Despite the reassurance, Nathan's heart pounded, anticipating the confrontation that would inevitably occur once they landed. In the flight deck, Captain Foster filed the necessary reports. Miss Ramirez was instructed to remain in the galley, away from passenger areas. The entire cabin was awash with a strange mixture of relief and apprehension. Passengers quietly awaited an ending to this surreal saga, each harboring private theories about Miss Ramirez's meltdown. As the Boeing 737 touched down on the runway, a collective breath was held. The plane taxied to the gate, and the seatbelt signs switched off with a soft chime. Normally, this was the cue for everyone to rush for their carry-on luggage. This time, however, they hesitated. Word had traveled that Port Authority police and airline officials would be boarding. When the door finally opened, two uniformed officers stepped inside, flanked by an airline representative. Captain Foster emerged from the cockpit to greet them. Meanwhile, Miss Ramirez remained out of sight, presumably in the galley, awaiting her fate. Nathan's pulse thrummed as he wondered if he would need to give an immediate statement to the authorities. He also wondered how quickly he could call his father and how Stephen Taylor would respond to the news that his son had been assaulted at 30,000 feet. The Port Authority officers introduced themselves as Officers Martinez and Howard. They spoke briefly with Captain Foster and Mr. Wells before turning their attention to Nathan. One approached carefully, adopting a calm but direct tone. "Son, I understand you've been through an ordeal," Officer Martinez said gently. "We need a quick statement from you and any witnesses." Nathan nodded, noticing Miss Ramirez had been escorted from the galley by the second officer. She avoided his gaze, her face pale. Passengers craned their necks to catch a glimpse of her as she passed. Some pulled out their phones again to record the aftermath. Mr. Wells handed over the written statement from Nathan. The officer scanned the page, occasionally asking clarifying questions. The entire time Miss Ramirez stood off to the side, her posture rigid hands clasped in front of her, as if she were both frightened and furious. "We may need you to come with us to fill out an incident report," Officer Howard said, turning toward Miss Ramirez. "This is a serious matter." Miss Ramirez lifted her chin. He was disobeying instructions and putting the flight at risk. Officer Howard shook his head. "That will be investigated, ma'am, but multiple witnesses have a different account." Nathan felt the weight of eyes on him, some sympathetic, some curious, but beneath the adrenaline he harbored a more pressing concern, contacting his father. Once outside the plane, once he had a signal, that phone call would set in motion a legal reckoning Miss Ramirez could scarcely imagine. Disembarking took far longer than usual, as passengers were asked to remain seated, so authorities could first escort Miss Ramirez off the plane. The older woman with the oxygen canister was given assistance by ground staff, and she insisted on speaking with the officers too, determined to defend Nathan's actions. Meanwhile, the teen Miss Ramirez had previously harassed also stepped forward, offering to share his story. Nathan watched the surreal procession from his seat. Miss Ramirez was led away, still protesting her innocence. Captain Foster shook Nathan's hand, offering him a reassuring pat on the back. "I'm sorry this happened," the captain said quietly. "Rest assured, the airline will address this incident properly." Once the area was cleared, the rest of the passengers were free to leave. Many approached Nathan to express their support, patting his shoulder or voicing their outrage. The anxious passenger from earlier gave him a tight hug, surprising them both. "Thank you for everything you did," he whispered. "I can't imagine what might have happened if you didn't speak up." Feeling overwhelmed, Nathan quietly made his way into the terminal. As soon as his phone connected to cellular service, a flurry of notifications lit the screen. He found a quiet corner and dialed his father's number. The phone rang once, twice, and then his father's familiar voice answered. "Dad?" Nathan's voice trembled slightly. "There's something I need to tell you. You're not going to believe what just happened on my flight." In that moment, the wheels of justice, long known to churn slowly, began to turn at breakneck speed. Stephen Taylor listened intently to his son's every word. Initially, his voice betrayed shock and anger, but soon it took on the measured calm of a seasoned attorney assessing a case. "Nathan," he said after taking a steadying breath, "I'm sorry you had to go through that. Are you physically all right? Are you hurt in any way?" Nathan assured him that aside from a sore cheek and rattled nerves, he was fine. The father's silence on the other end of the line spoke volumes. In the background, Nathan could hear the rustling of paper, likely Stephen jotting down details or preparing to switch into full legal mode. "Listen to me carefully," Stephen said. "I want you to remain at the terminal. Do not leave. I'll arrange a car service and fly out as soon as I can. I'm also going to contact the airline and authorities. This will not go unanswered." After ending the call, Nathan felt both relief and lingering tension. He knew his father's involvement would change everything. Stephen Taylor had built his reputation on handling cases involving abuse of power, discrimination, and malpractice. To some, he was a crusader for justice. To others, a relentless bulldog who never let go once he sank his teeth into a case. Nathan found a bench near baggage claim. He didn't care about retrieving his suitcase yet. All he wanted was to close his eyes and block out the last few hours. Yet, as adrenaline drained away, a new wave of realization washed over him. Miss Ramirez had no idea whom she had struck. By the time Stephen Taylor was through, she would. While Nathan waited in the terminal, airline officials approached him. A woman named Joanne, her ID badge showing she worked in customer relations, spoke with earnest sympathy. "Mr. Taylor, I'm terribly sorry for the incident. The airline is fully cooperating with the authorities. We'd like to offer you a private waiting area and any necessary medical attention." Nathan politely declined medical attention, insisting he just needed a place to sit. Joanne guided him to a quiet lounge, offering him complimentary food and beverages. He barely touched them, nerves still jittery. Though exhausted, his mind replayed the slap again and again. An hour later, a car service arrived, courtesy of his father. The driver, a professionally dressed woman, introduced herself as Harriet. She escorted Nathan to a sleek black sedan. Pulling away from the airport, Harriet informed him that Stephen Taylor had arranged for him to check into a nearby hotel. "Your father will join you tonight," she explained. "He's catching the next flight out." During the drive, Nathan stared at the city skyline, his thoughts drifting. He wondered how Miss Ramirez was faring at this moment. Was she being interrogated by airline officials? By the police? Would she try to fabricate a story? The notion of potential lies fueled his anger, but he reminded himself that truth has a way of surfacing, especially when Stephen Taylor was involved. The car eventually arrived at the hotel. Nathan thanked Harriet and made his way to the lobby. The staff, already alerted by his father, welcomed him with sympathetic smiles. Nathan headed to his room, where he finally allowed the exhaustion of the day to overtake him, drifting into a restless sleep with the knowledge that this was far from over. Stephen Taylor arrived in New York later that evening. Nathan awoke to a soft knock on his hotel door, opening it to find his father standing there, shoulders tense and eyes burning with anger, barely contained behind his professional demeanor. They hugged briefly, father and son sharing a moment of relief that each was safe. Over a quick dinner in the hotel restaurant, Nathan recounted every detail, from Miss Ramirez's initial rudeness to the slap that halted the entire cabin. Stephen listened intently, nodding at intervals but never interrupting. His calm exterior reminded Nathan of the countless times his father had prepped for trial, dispassionate, observant, methodical. "I've already spoken with the airline's legal department," Stephen said in a measured tone. "They're launching an internal investigation. The Port Authority Police will also be filing a report. We'll need to cooperate fully." He paused, exhaling slowly. "But rest assured, the law is on our side. Flight attendants are trained professionals, and striking a passenger is beyond unacceptable." Nathan felt a surge of gratitude. He admired his father's confidence. Though the emotional wound still stung, he found solace in the knowledge that his father's advocacy would bring justice. They headed back to the room, discussing the potential legal avenues. "This won't be just about money or an apology, Nathan," Stephen clarified. "This is about ensuring such behavior is never repeated. It's about setting an example that power can't be abused without consequences." As the night wore on, father and son devised their plan, unaware of the deeper entanglements about to surface, entanglements that would pull them further into a suspenseful web of airline politics and hidden agendas. Morning light streamed through the curtains as Nathan and Stephen made their way to a nearby office tower housing a regional headquarters for the airline. There, they met with a team, a corporate attorney named Miss Graham, a representative from Human Resources, and a senior supervisor from the In-Flight Services Department. Miss Graham spoke first, offering a clipped smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Mr. Taylor, Mr. Nathan Taylor, we'd like to once again express our sincerest apologies. The behavior exhibited by Miss Ramirez is, without question, unacceptable. We are prepared to take immediate disciplinary action." Stephen nodded, maintaining a polite but firm demeanor. "I appreciate your swift response, but you must realize the gravity of this incident. My son was physically assaulted in front of multiple witnesses. We expect a transparent investigation and appropriate consequences." The HR representative cleared his throat. "Miss Ramirez has been placed on indefinite suspension, pending a full review. We will also cover any medical expenses, therapy, or other costs related to your son's well-being." Nathan listened quietly, his heart pounding. He was relieved that they were taking decisive action. But a nagging thought intruded. Was Miss Ramirez just a rogue employee, or was there more to this story? Suddenly, the in-flight services supervisor spoke up. We've received some concerning information about Miss Ramirez's record. There have been prior complaints, none as severe as this, but enough to indicate a pattern of inappropriate conduct. Stephen's expression hardened. Then why was she still allowed to serve passengers? The supervisor looked uneasy, glancing at Miss Graham for help. This is why we're taking your son's case so seriously. We want to address any systemic failures in our organization and ensure passenger safety. Though these assurances were promising, Stephen could sense another layer to this unfolding drama, one that might lead them down an even darker path. After the meeting, father and son stepped into the bustling New York street. Taxis honked, and the crowd flowed around them, but their focus remained locked on the matter at hand. Stephen received a call from the police detective assigned to the case, requesting a formal statement and an official interview with Nathan. They arrived at the precinct later that day. Officer Martinez from the Port Authority was also present, coordinating with the local detectives. Over the next hour, Nathan recounted the ordeal in precise detail, occasionally pausing to steady his voice when memories of the slap made his pulse race. Stephen quietly observed, adding clarifications only when needed. When the interview concluded, Detective Reynolds placed a comforting hand on Nathan's shoulder. "We take assaults seriously, even if they happen at 30,000 feet. Rest assured, we have enough witness statements and footage to proceed with potential charges against Miss Ramirez." Nathan nodded, grateful for the detective's support. A tangle of thoughts crowded his mind: Miss Ramirez's aggression, the potential legal ramifications, and the airline's internal failures. It was an emotional upheaval he wasn't accustomed to. After leaving the precinct, Stephen paused on the steps outside. "Nathan," he said quietly, "how are you holding up? Truly." Nathan exhaled, shoulders slumping. "I'm okay, Dad. Just overwhelmed." Stephen smiled gently. "We'll get through this, and we'll make it right. Trust me." As they hailed a cab, neither father nor son realized that Miss Ramirez, embittered and cornered by mounting evidence, was already plotting her own countermove, one that could plunge them all into an even deeper whirlpool of conflict. Just when Nathan thought he could exhale, a storm brewed on social media. The businessman who had recorded the slap uploaded his footage to a major platform, and it quickly went viral. Overnight, hashtags like #airline assault and #flight fiasco trended nationwide. News outlets picked up the story, adding fuel to the fire of public outrage. At the hotel breakfast lounge the next morning, Nathan scrolled through an endless barrage of comments on his phone. Some posts expressed heartfelt support, while others, lacking full context, resorted to speculation. Was the teenager rude? Did he provoke the attendant? The swirling rumors frustrated Nathan, especially since he prided himself on being respectful. Stephen approached, phone in hand. "I've received multiple interview requests," he said quietly. "CNN, local stations, even some morning talk shows. We should consider how to handle the media." Nathan looked up, anxiety flickering in his eyes. "Do we have to go public with this?" Stephen offered a reassuring nod. "We don't have to do anything we're uncomfortable with. But given the viral nature, it might be wise to present the facts clearly. Otherwise, misinformation will run rampant." Before they could plan their media approach, Stephen's phone buzzed again. He checked the caller ID, a perplexed expression crossing his face. Stepping away, he answered, "Hello. She did what?" Nathan couldn't hear the other end, but he watched his father's brow furrow in disbelief. When Stephen ended the call, he turned back to Nathan. "That was Miss Graham from the airline. Miss Ramirez just held a press conference claiming you acted violently first. She's accusing you of assault." Nathan's jaw dropped. The audacity of Miss Ramirez's lie instantly transformed his shock into a fierce resolve. The drama had just escalated in a way no one saw coming. Miss Ramirez's press conference aired on local news stations later that day. Standing behind a podium with her own attorney, a stern-looking man in a grey suit, she spun a narrative that left viewers reeling. She claimed Nathan had berated her, used obscene language, and even threatened to cause a disturbance on the aircraft. Her attorney provided no evidence, but the sensational accusations were enough to stir the pot of public opinion. That evening, Stephen and Nathan watched the broadcast in disbelief from their hotel room. It was a twisted version of events, lacking corroboration but packaged for maximum drama. "This is ludicrous," Stephen said, gripping the remote so tightly his knuckles turned white. "We have witnesses and footage disproving every word." Nathan felt a mixture of rage and heartbreak. While he understood that Miss Ramirez might be desperate, he never imagined she would stoop to outright lies in a televised setting. He looked to his father. "How do we fight this?" Stephen set the remote down. "First, we respond calmly and professionally. I've already contacted the airline's legal team. They'll issue an official statement refuting her claims. Next, we'll ensure that the recorded video is properly authenticated and shared. If she wants to escalate this, we'll meet her every step of the way, but we won't stoop to her tactics." Nathan nodded, feeling the spark of determination reignite. Despite the emotional toll, he trusted his father's approach. The prospect of a legal showdown loomed on the horizon, but Stephen Taylor had never lost a case when justice was on his side. And Miss Ramirez was about to learn that lesson the hard way. Within days, the legal battle picked up steam. Stephen wasted no time filing a civil suit against Miss Ramirez and the airline, alleging assault and negligence. In response, Miss Ramirez's attorney mounted a defense, painting her as a dedicated flight attendant pushed to the brink by unruly passengers. The public watched the drama unfold with bated breath, social media ablaze with hot takes and opinion pieces. Meanwhile, Nathan found himself thrust into an unanticipated spotlight. Journalists approached him for interviews, sometimes even following him to the courthouse. Initially hesitant, he decided to break his silence in a sit-down interview alongside his father. The segment was broadcast on a major network. Under the soft glow of studio lights, Nathan recounted his version of events, his voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of hurt. Stephen provided legal context, emphasizing the eyewitness testimonies and video footage that contradicted Miss Ramirez's claims. The interviewer pressed for details, but father and son handled each question with poise, revealing just enough to establish the truth while respecting ongoing legal proceedings. Behind the scenes, Miss Ramirez doubled down, providing her own witnesses, former co-workers with questionable credibility, who alleged that Nathan had a history of disrespectful behavior. Yet none of them had flown on the same flight, and their statements lacked specifics. The more Miss Ramirez tried to bolster her false narrative, the thinner her credibility wore. In the court of public opinion, momentum swung decisively in Nathan's favor, but the real test would come in a courtroom where evidence, not social media clamor, would ultimately decide Miss Ramirez's fate. The pre-trial hearing arrived with a media circus outside the courthouse. Cameras flashed, and reporters shouted questions as Stephen and Nathan stepped out of a black sedan. Miss Ramirez arrived moments later, her attorney flanking her protectively. She avoided eye contact with Nathan, eyes fixed on the ground. Inside, the judge reviewed motions and evidence. Stephen presented the video footage captured by the businessman, along with sworn statements from multiple passengers and crew members. The evidence was damning. Miss Ramirez's slap was clearly visible, as was Nathan's non-threatening posture. The judge allowed a moment to review the recordings, his expression shifting from neutrality to thinly veiled disapproval. Miss Ramirez's attorney attempted to undermine the witnesses' credibility, accusing them of collusion or sensationalism. But these efforts fell short, particularly when the elderly woman, aided by her oxygen, spoke with unwavering clarity about Nathan's kindness and Miss Ramirez's disproportionate aggression. By the hearing's end, the judge found there was sufficient evidence to proceed to trial. He also granted a temporary restraining order prohibiting Miss Ramirez from contacting Nathan or appearing at locations he frequented. As the gavel banged, tension filled the air, a foretaste of the trial that lay ahead. Outside, the press swarmed. Stephen made a brief statement. "We trust in the legal process. We believe in accountability, especially when an individual in a position of responsibility oversteps to the point of violence." Unbeknownst to anyone, however, Miss Ramirez had one more card to play, one that she believed could turn the tide in her favor, even at the 11th hour. As the days turned into weeks, both legal teams prepared vigorously for trial. Stephen delved into Miss Ramirez's past, obtaining records that indicated a pattern of misconduct. Nathan provided additional testimony, undergoing multiple depositions where Miss Ramirez's attorney tried to discredit his character. With each passing session, the holes in Miss Ramirez's story widened. Behind closed doors, Miss Ramirez seethed. She knew her options were dwindling. In a desperate move, she reached out to a disgruntled former associate of Stephen Taylor, an opposing counsel from a previous case. This individual, James Lorenz, had lost a high-profile lawsuit against Stephen years ago and had been harboring resentment ever since. Miss Ramirez and Lorenz devised a plan to leak fabricated documents suggesting that Stephen Taylor used questionable legal tactics. The documents falsely implied that Nathan had a history of being coached to cause public confrontations for monetary gain, a preposterous notion. Yet Lorenz believed it could muddy the waters enough to sow doubt. Late one night, these falsified documents appeared in the inboxes of several tabloid outlets and lesser-known news blogs. The sensational headline, "Star Attorney's Son Allegedly Stirs Chaos for Profit," trended briefly among unscrupulous publications. Stephen received alerts about the smear campaign just before midnight. Infuriated but composed, he gathered his legal associates, determined to squash the lies. He knew Lorenz's style. The man was careless and left a trail of digital breadcrumbs. Still, the stress weighed heavily. Nathan watched his father pace the hotel suite, phone in hand, a steely resolve etched into his features. The next few days would decide whether justice would prevail or be consumed by deceit. Trial day arrived. A crowd gathered outside the courthouse, the atmosphere electric with anticipation. The swirling rumors and tabloid chatter threatened to overshadow the core issue, a flight attendant's assault on a teenage passenger. Nevertheless, Stephen remained unwavering in his focus. Inside the courtroom, the judge took his seat. Miss Ramirez sat beside her lawyer, her posture tense, face pale. Stephen and Nathan took their respective seats, joined by witnesses ready to testify. Opening arguments began. Miss Ramirez's attorney repeated allegations that Nathan was a disruptive presence, while Stephen supposedly orchestrated the conflict for financial gain. The judge listened impassively, hands folded. Then it was Stephen's turn. Stepping forward, he spoke with an even, resonant voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, we stand here because a person entrusted with passenger welfare chose violence over duty. My son, who did nothing more than assist a fellow passenger, was struck and humiliated." He paused, letting the gravity settle. "Today, we present clear video evidence, multiple eyewitness testimonies, and the undeniable fact that Miss Ramirez violated the most fundamental tenet of her profession, to safeguard passengers, not harm them." Witness after witness took the stand. The elderly passenger offered a tearful recounting of the moment Nathan helped her. The anxious man described how Miss Ramirez's hostility exacerbated his fear of flying. The younger attendant, Mr. Wells, recounted Miss Ramirez's suspicious temperament during the flight. Each testimony fortified Nathan's case, painting a picture of an unpredictable flight attendant teetering on the edge. Miss Ramirez watched it all, her gaze growing darker by the minute. She gripped the edges of the table, fully realizing that the fortress of lies she'd tried to build was collapsing, piece by piece. Miss Ramirez's lawyer tried valiantly to dismantle the evidence, but the video footage played multiple times in slow motion showed her hand making harsh contact with Nathan's face. Combined with the consistent accounts of witnesses, her defense struggled to gain traction. Finally, Miss Ramirez herself took the stand. Her hands trembled as she recited a prepared statement, insisting she'd been under duress and that Nathan's movements seemed threatening. However, under cross-examination, Stephen methodically picked apart her claims. Each pointed question forced her to contradict prior statements or the documented facts. At one point, Miss Ramirez broke down, sobbing that she feared for her job and financial security. "I've been dealing with personal issues," she confessed, tears streaming down her cheeks. "My mother is ill, and I was under so much stress. I just snapped." A wave of sympathetic murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Even Nathan felt a pang of compassion for her distress, though it didn't excuse what she had done. The judge, unflinching, reminded the court that while personal hardships may offer context, they do not absolve an individual of accountability for violent acts. In the end, Miss Ramirez's emotional plea seemed more like a final, desperate attempt to sway the jury. Stephen maintained a respectful but firm tone throughout, emphasizing that personal struggles cannot justify assaulting a minor. The case neared its conclusion, tension so thick it felt like a physical presence in the courtroom. All that remained was the verdict, a decision that would determine whether Nathan's quest for justice would reach its rightful end. After days of testimony, cross-examinations, and emotional revelations, the jury deliberated. Tension gripped everyone as they awaited the final decision. Outside the courthouse, reporters discussed possible outcomes. Polls suggested overwhelming public support for Nathan, and social media buzzed with speculation. Finally, the moment arrived. The bailiff led the jury back into the courtroom. The foreperson stood, cleared her throat, and announced the verdict. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Miss Ramirez, liable for the civil assault of Nathan Taylor. We recommend punitive damages to be awarded." A sudden, collective exhale rippled through the room. Miss Ramirez collapsed into her chair, her face drained of color. Tears streamed down her cheeks, a mixture of fear and defeat. Stephen turned to Nathan, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. The judge ordered Miss Ramirez to pay a substantial sum in damages, a portion of which would be donated to a charity benefiting victims of abuse, one of Stephen's conditions for the settlement. In addition, the airline, facing public backlash and acknowledging their oversight in retaining Miss Ramirez, despite her record of complaints, agreed to implement stricter screening and training programs for their staff. They also issued a formal apology to Nathan, which was read aloud in court by their legal representative. Nathan and Stephen emerged from the courthouse to a swarm of flashing cameras and microphones. With Stephen beside him, Nathan addressed the crowd briefly. This case wasn't about money or attention. It was about standing up against abuse of power. I hope this verdict encourages others to speak out if they experience something similar. The father and son exchanged a relieved smile, knowing they had not only won a legal victory, but also helped spark meaningful change. Justice, at last, was served. We hope this story kept you on the edge of your seat from takeoff to final verdict, demonstrating that even in the most unexpected moments, justice can triumph over injustice. It's a reminder that power, when misused, will eventually meet its downfall, and that standing up for what's right can create ripple effects far beyond any single incident. Now that we've shared this remarkable tale of a teenager, a flight attendant, and a powerful attorney's unwavering resolve, we invite you to continue supporting stories that reveal the truth. If you found this narrative riveting, please remember to like this video, share it with friends, and subscribe to our channel for more engaging content. Your support means everything.